Okay, we're now recording. So we're going to try and avoid any Zoom bombing. So your microphones and screens are going to be muted and shut off. It also helps conserve bandwidth for our presentation. And we encourage you to view this in speaker view, the full screen mode, which is just at the bottom of your screens for most people. Sometimes it's in the top right-hand corner. And then if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat, which has that little messenger icon. And at the end, I'll be moderating the questions and we'll save all of those for the end. But feel free to type in your questions as we go so that you can get some engagement with David. And okay, I think that's all. Next slide. As I said, I'm with the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, and we're a nonprofit that has been in Alaska, founded by Alaskans in 1978 to advocate for ecosystem-based management in our state. And we have multiple programs, but one of our big programs is education. And through that, we have these Wildlife Wednesdays, which we normally host in person in Soldotna, Juneau, and Anchorage, but we've turned remote due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're really excited to be engaging with you all in this way. So if you are not a member, we would love to have your membership and support. We're on Amazon Smile, Pick, Click, Give, the combined federal campaign, or you can visit our website to learn more about that. Next slide, David. And welcome everyone who's coming on. This is a quick pitch for those of you who aren't following us on Facebook. This is where we post a lot of our news. We have Trivia Tuesdays and calls for action. So give us a follow on Facebook as a way to stay engaged with Alaska Wildlife Alliance. And we also have an email list once a month that you can sign up for on our website, which is akwildlife.org. Next slide. Great, and every Wildlife Wednesday we kick off with some opportunities for comments, getting people engaged in wildlife actions across the state. So one of them that's coming up is the National Park Service has a comment period open until June 29th, so you have a little over a month. And this regards navigable waterways as defined by the Sturgeon case last year. So the proposed regulation would clarify navigable waterways, within national parklands in Alaska. And so if you have experience in this, if this is something that you would like to comment on, that comment opportunity is coming up on June 29th. Thank you. Next slide, David. Great. And as I said, we're recording this Wildlife Wednesday. We'll post it on our website. And if you missed some of our prior Wildlife Wednesdays, we have those on our website as well. We also have the teaser for a documentary that we're working on in partnership with an independent filmmaker about Denali's wolves, and then we also have our next Wildlife Wednesday, which is a career spotlight about wild Alaska veterinary pathology with Dr. Kathy Burek. So tune into that on June 17th. Next slide. And with that, I would like to very warmly and eagerly introduce you to tonight's speaker, as David teaches us about the taxonomy, natural history, population status, and management of Canada and cackling geese in Alaska. And I will say that we have Wildlife Wednesdays all over the state throughout the year, and this topic is one that has been specifically requested. So there's a lot of people very interested in these particular birds, so we're excited to have a resident expert talk to us about them. And a little bit about David. He is a waterfowl biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Division of Migratory Bird Management, based in Anchorage, and has spent most of his career working on research and monitoring projects for multiple species of ducks and geese, but has the most experience working with Alaska's two threatened eider species, which are the speckled eider and Steller's eider. And currently his job duties include serving as an observer on aerial surveys, a liaison to the Pacific Flyway's technical team, and a member of the Eider Recovery Team. So a Renaissance man if there ever was one. And David, I think there's one more slide that I'm ready for. And before I hand it over to David, I just want to say thank you preemptively, because this speaking at public events takes a lot of time. David did this all volunteer, and we are so appreciative of his time and effort. So thank you, David. Thank you to all the AWA members and supporters that we have. And thanks everyone for tuning in tonight on this beautiful Wednesday. We're really excited to share this time with you. So with that, David, I'll let you take it away.
All right. I assume I'm unmuted and you guys can hear me. Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm gonna start on my slides here. I will try to look at you guys, but I've got kind of multiple monitors going here. And I'm understanding that when my cursor is here that you guys can see it, so I may be pointing to stuff periodically. And I appreciate you guys' attention today. And I hope that those folks that did have specific interest and questions about Canada geese are able to get those answered today. And if I don't answer your questions while I'm going through this today, please, I guess, text them in at the end. I think we're going to go through the whole talk and then hold questions for the end, and then I will address as many of those as I can. We'll just get started here. Okay, so today I'm going to kind of start with a broad overview of the waterfowl program in migratory bird management in Alaska, Fish and Wildlife Service. Then I'm going to talk about what I'm here to talk about, which is Canada and cackling geese. Tell you guys about the taxonomy of those birds and how they were split into various subspecies and the changes that have occurred. I'll talk a little bit about the natural history of these guys, nesting, foraging, migration, those kind of things. Population status, so the numbers, the abundance of the various subspecies, how they're doing with respect to our management objectives. Then I'll talk about how we manage these species from the perspective of what the agencies do, how we work with the hunting community and others, and how we create management plans. And then, like I said, at the end, I'll address folks' questions or comments. Okay, so Nicole already gave a introduction to myself, but I guess just a quick note that I've been working in Alaska for about 20 years now, and like Nicole said, most of my background is working with sea ducks. I have also worked with dabbling ducks, which are the ducks that you see commonly like mallards, pintail, widgeon. I've done a little bit of work with what we call poachards or diving ducks. Some people call them bay ducks, so those would be scaup, canvasback, redhead. And then some work with geese, including the ones we're talking about, cackling Canada geese. Some of my first jobs in Alaska were with cackling geese. And then a little bit of work with white-fronted geese. But really I'm more of an expert on sea ducks. I do know a little bit about geese, and I'll be talking about that today, but they are not the species that I have the most experience with. And like she said, my job has a lot of different components to it. Some are field-based, some are office-based. And as folks know, this particular summer is going to be a little bit different than previous summers of my employment with Fish and Wildlife Service. I'll be spending a lot more time in the office for obvious reasons. So things are going to be a little different. And also the way that we manage waterfowl this summer and fall is going to be a little bit different because we're going to have a lot less data coming in. So anyway, things will be a little bit interesting this year, and we'll be learning how to manage with a little bit more uncertainty than we're used to. So, all right. Okay, so just a little bit about the Migratory Bird Management Waterfowl program that I work for. So we focus generally in three main areas. We focus on harvest management. That's kind of our bread and butter, if you will. And for that particular area, we conduct the aerial surveys and we provide the data that's used to understand and assess each different population of geese and the ducks that we have and swans in Alaska. So we do a lot of aerial surveys and banding. We get information on population status, and then we use that information to help set hunting regulations. We also do that same kind of work with surveys and banding to get information on the status of the two threatened species that we have in Alaska. So that would be spectacled and Steller's eiders. And then we use that to help evaluate their status with respect to recovery criteria, working with the interagency Eider Recovery Team. And then lastly, we do work that for habitat conservation, same type of work we're doing, but in this case, it's used to understand the distribution of a species. And then we'd be using that information to help design or help folks that are doing development do so in a way that's protecting the migratory bird species in the area. So minimizing impacts of development. So a lot of that work is going on, a lot of our survey work on the North Slope would be addressing habitat conservation and development. Okay, so just a quick slide to show what some of us look like in our program. Let's see, I'll put the cursor up here. This guy up here at the top, his name is Julian Fisher. He supervises the waterfowl program, which is within migratory bird management. And then this guy right here is named Eric Osnes. He supervises the quantitative ecology program. So those are our statisticians, or we call them biometricians. So we have two quantitative folks, Eric and Chuck here. And then the rest of these folks are all part of the waterfowl program. We have two pilots in the program. One has recently retired. We're in the process of hiring some more pilots. And then the rest of us are biologists and observers. And I believe this person right here, Debbie, may be on the phone today. So anyway, there may be others that are listening in today. Okay. So our program, like I talked about earlier, our bread and butter is harvest management. It's doing so using aerial surveys. And so we have three amphibious Cessna 206 aircraft that we're using right now. In the past, we've had different types of aircraft, but right now that's what we're using. And I'm sure for folks around Alaska, you see amphibious aircraft periodically. They're not quite as common as straight float planes without the wheels below, but you do see them. And so these three tail numbers are the aircraft that we own and operate. And they are based out of Anchorage, Alaska. Okay, so a couple quick definitions. I realize given this talk to a variety of different type of folks, I want to make sure to explain a couple terms before I talk about them and not assume that people know them. And for those that do, it'll just be a little bit of review. Okay, waterfowl, I'm gonna quickly talk about what does that mean? What is waterfowl? What are waterfowl? And then flyways, I'm gonna talk about that really briefly. Just two quick concepts that I'll explain because these will come up obviously throughout the talk today. Okay, so waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans. Most folks know that, some folks don't. Some people think that waterfowl includes things like loons and grebes, which it does not. So Anseriformes is an order, and these three groups are within there. In this picture, of course, I'm sure you guys know what these are. They, like I said earlier, are dabbling ducks, but within ducks, we have multiple different what we call tribes. So we have dabbling ducks, like I talked about earlier, bay ducks. We have sea ducks, so eiders, mergansers, scoters. We have perching ducks like wood ducks. So there's within each of these groups, there's what we call different tribes. Then we have geese in Alaska. We have multiple different species of geese and swans. We have 2 swans in Alaska, the trumpeter and tundra swan. Okay, so that's just a quick note on that. And then what are the traits that make those birds waterfowl? What are the traits that all waterfowl have in common? So number 1, all waterfowl go through what's called a flightless molt, which means there's a period of time, often it's 3 to 4 weeks, that they're completely flightless. And so in this picture here is a group of greater white-fronted geese in interior Alaska. And none of these birds can fly, and oftentimes we take advantage of that as a time to round the birds up and ban them to get information on things like survival rates, harvest rates, etc. So flightless molt, that is a characteristic trait of waterfowl. Webbed feet, everybody knows about webbed feet. You know, some of the birds that you see, coots, for instance, they have partially webbed feet. You know, some of the rails, right? So, but a fully webbed foot is characteristic of waterfowl. Precocial young, all right? There are multiple different types of birds that have precocial young. However, you know, so precocial young means very soon after hatching, they are able to feed themselves and move around independently. And so the antithesis of that would be altricial young, which would be things like a robin, for instance, that they hatch, they stay in the nest for 12 days or so, they have to be fed by their parents, they have no feathers, they're completely helpless at the beginning. Waterfowl are not like that. And the last trait I'm going to talk about is true down. So everybody knows what down is. It's been used for a long time in different types of clothing, sleeping bags, etc. Anyway, true down is a trait of waterfowl, all waterfowl. Okay, so briefly, I want to talk about the flyway system. This was established in the 1940s. People had started banding birds in North America and started understanding there were specific patterns in the way birds moved. So these birds weren't just randomly moving all over the place, although some birds do that, but generally speaking, they were moving in the north-south direction. So a lot of the birds they might mark in Alaska would end up, say, down in California, Oregon, Washington, etc. If they mark birds in Arctic Canada in the central area, they may end up down in Texas or Louisiana. Okay, so each of these areas was generally speaking a north-south movement of birds, and they used those patterns to help designate flyways in North America. And these flyways now have become administrative units where groups of states get together and work cooperatively to set hunting regulations, because migratory birds don't stay within one state. They move among states and among countries. And so you need to work together between the US, Canada, and Mexico, and among all the states using the flyway system to manage waterfowl. Alaska has a strong tie with the Pacific Flyway. A lot of our birds end up particularly along the Pacific coast. However, birds in Alaska go into all 4 flyways. For instance, tundra swans on the north slope of Alaska, they'll end up on the Atlantic Flyway oftentimes. So our birds can end up in any flyways, but we do have a very strong link with the Pacific Flyway, and we in Alaska and the Fish and Wildlife Service work most closely with the Pacific Flyway, and to a lesser extent with the Central and Mississippi Flyways. Okay, so this is what I'm actually here to talk about, which is Canada geese. So now that we got some of that background material out of the way. Canada geese originally were thought of as one species with 11 different subspecies. I guess it used to be 12. One of them went extinct, but we have 11 subspecies right now. And so we referred to these with a subspecies name and then Canada goose. So for example, Aleutian Canada goose, Cackling Canada goose, Dusky Canada goose. So this is how we referred to these species. In 2004, The American Ornithologists Union, which is an entity that collects all the expertise on avian science, decided that it was appropriate to split Canada geese into two species, Canada and cackling geese. So this happened in 2004. So when we talk about Canada geese, they are Branta canadensis, and cackling geese, Branta hutchinsii. We call cackling geese small-bodied birds. We call Canada geese large-bodied birds. So this was the split that occurred then, and from that point forward, the American Ornithologists Union recognized these as two species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did not recognize them as two species until this year, 2020. So as is common in the government, we take a while to respond to things, but we now in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are recognizing officially through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and amendments in the Federal Register them now as two different species. Okay. So why did we make this split? Why can't we just keep them as Canada geese? What's the point? Okay, so for many, many years, people have described differences in the voice of these birds, the nesting habitats, timing of migration, lengths of migration, colors, size of the birds, etc. And then more recently, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot more work done using genetics that started documenting that actually these morphological traits that people were noticing are actually also reflected in genetics. So there's what we call mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through your mother and passed down. That mitochondrial DNA, there are different varieties, and we call them haplotypes. And it just so happens that all small-bodied Canada geese, the cackling geese, can be among a certain suite of those different varieties of mitochondrial DNA. And all the large-bodied, or the Canada geese, are within another suite of mitochondrial DNA. So there's a clean break where there are no mitochondrial DNA types shared between the two species. So that helped to seal the deal, so to speak. So in general, and so the picture I have up here on my screen is a large body and small bodied haplotype, just as an example. So when people think about DNA, you know, there's the four different components of the G, A, T, and C of the DNA. And at every place down the sequence, that's what a haplotype is. So it's a unique set of different characters, if you will. So this is an example of when you actually run out mitochondrial DNA, what it looks like and how you can use that to tell apart a Canada from a cackling goose. Okay, but in general, how do you tell them apart? Okay, a cackling goose tends to have smaller bills, smaller body, a higher pitch call. They tend to nest in the open tundra, not in the forest. And generally speaking, they're going to migrate a little bit longer. These are all general traits, but as a whole, that is generally how, you know, morphological differences. Okay, so when we think about these two species now together, we oftentimes call them white-cheeked geese when we talk about both cackling and Canada geese. There are 11 different subspecies, 4 different subspecies of cackling geese, 7 of Canada geese. In Alaska, we have 6 of these subspecies, so we have just over half of them. We have what's called the Minima subspecies, which previously people called cackling Canada geese. Now that seems a little bit silly to call them cackling geese. So we're gonna have to work on some new naming, but there's other names out there like the Ridgeways or lesser Pacific cackling goose. So that's something that we will be working on here at some point, but we can probably will no longer be calling them cackling cackling geese at any rate. There is the Aleutian cackling goose and Taverner's cackling goose. So those are our 3 subspecies of cackling geese. And I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail as we go. Then on the Canada goose side, we have Lessers, Duskies, and Vancouvers. So those are the 3 species of Canada geese. Okay, so now I'm going to go through and talk about each subspecies, give you a little bit of background. Obviously, I'll run out of time if I spend too much time on each of these, but just so you get a feel for each of these different subspecies. Okay, so this is the Minima subspecies that I was just talking about. This is one of my personal favorites, and later on in the talk, I'll be using them as an example to talk about natural history, management, etc. They are one of the subspecies that we probably know the most about for a variety of reasons. They've been studied pretty extensively. They're very important for subsistence and fall-winter hunting activities. These guys are the smallest cackling goose, so they're the smallest of all these white-cheeked geese. They breed just on the coastal fringe of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So, you know, that's in basically western Alaska, and they're right out on the coast. So they're breeding on coastal tundra. They have a very high-pitched characteristic call. And these guys are wintering down in the western parts of Oregon and Washington. They used to winter a lot more in California, but now they're wintering primarily in Oregon and Washington. So you notice in this picture here how short and stubby that bill is. Very short neck, very dark breast. And they are literally, you know, about the size of a mallard, a little bit bigger than a mallard. So they're a very small goose. Okay, so the next size up, if you will, and as I go through these subspecies, I'm going to be moving in gradation from small to large. So now we're on leucopareia, which is the Aleutian cackling goose. These guys nest along the Aleutian Islands, particularly the western and central Aleutian Islands. There's also a small population that nests in the Samiti Islands, which is kind of southwest of Kodiak Island. So these guys are maritime island nesting Canada geese. They're a little bit larger and lighter than the Minima subspecies, and the neck ring is very characteristic on Aleutian Canada geese. They don't all necessarily have it, but it's a characteristic feature of them. These guys were listed as an endangered species, then moved to threatened species, and eventually removed from the list in 2001. So they were recovered using a bunch of reintroduction efforts out in the Aleutians, and also by eradicating foxes off the islands that they nested on. So Fish and Wildlife Service was doing a lot of work back in the, I believe, 1960s and 70s, et cetera, to help get these guys recovered. And again, by 2001, they were able to remove them off the list. So they were a success story. They are wintering now, most of them in the Central Valley of California, with some wintering on the west coast of Oregon. And I'll talk about their status a little more later. Okay, Taverners, this is the last of our cackling geese, so Taverneri. These guys are also tundra nesters. They are nesting primarily in the tundra of western, northwestern, and then the Arctic slope of Alaska. So they are a coastal tundra nester, but they can be nesting a bit farther inland than the cackling Canada geese. Sorry, I just called them by their old name. Minima, let's go with that. These guys are nesting a little bit further inland on the Yukon Delta, and then they're nesting on the Seward Peninsula, etc. They are the largest of the cackling geese. They are lighter than the other 2 subspecies, a little bit larger bill and longer neck. And they're wintering in Oregon and Washington. But these guys are wintering in both eastern Oregon and Washington, like in the Columbia Basin, and also western Oregon and Washington. Whereas the Minima subspecies is primarily wintering only in western Oregon and Washington. Okay. All right, so now we're moving into Canada geese. So now we're on the smallest of the Canada geese. This subspecies is called parvipes. We commonly call them lesser Canada geese. These are the Canada geese, if you live in Anchorage or in South Central Alaska, these are our Canada geese that are resident and nesting in the area in the summertime. So now we've shifted over from these sort of tundra nesting cackling geese. Now we're on to Canada geese, which are more of a forest nesting species. So if you were looking around Anchorage, for instance, you would find them nesting in these open boggy areas with stumpy spruce trees kind of right around Anchorage. They nest in South Central Alaska, as I already noted, throughout the interior. There's even a few of them going out into Western Alaska and even on the North Slope. So they have a really wide range. They're also nesting into northwestern Canada, quite a ways. So they have a really large breeding range. Like I said before, they're the smallest Canada goose. They also have a light breast, kind of like the Taverners. And I'm just noting here that they're oftentimes associated with river corridors. So if you were on a canoe trip on the Tanana River out of Fairbanks, you might see these guys hanging out on the gravel bars this time of year. So they'd be nesting along the rivers. When we're up on the North Slope flying surveys, you may see lots of Canada geese out on the coast, but if you come inland sometimes, there may be a few Canada geese along the Colville River, some of these larger rivers actually on the river, and those are likely lesser Canada geese. Same thing along the Yukon. So sometimes they're associated with rivers. They're wintering in Oregon, Washington, pretty much the same areas that the Taverners. So Taverners and lessers in a lot of ways are very similar. Just one's just on one side of the Canada goose spectrum and one's just on the other side in the cackling goose, but they look kind of similar. It's just that one is more of an interior nester and one is more of a coastal nester. Okay, now Dusky Canada geese, occidentalis. So these guys are primarily found on the Copper River Delta, Middleton Island, and then sometimes in Prince William Sound. So they are sort of the northern extent of the rainforest, if you will, and then Middleton Island. They are larger than the lessers and they're very dark. So they have a very dark breast and a larger bill. These guys are one of the smallest goose populations that we have among all the geese. And part of that is because they were affected significantly by the 1964 earthquake when the Copper River Delta uplifted by several meters. And during that time, it changed the habitat out there and made it forested and shrubby and made it a little bit less productive for Duskies out there. So their populations have been struggling, and these guys are close to hunting down in the lower 48, so Oregon and Washington, the season is closed. And in Alaska, there is a limited hunt, but probably very few of these guys are taken. So these guys are the most protected of the Canada geese right now. They are wintering in northwestern Oregon, particularly the Willamette Valley, and then also in southwestern Washington. And the presence of Dusky Canada geese in the lower 48 affects a lot of the management of Canada geese. So wherever these guys are found, oftentimes they have to close all the other goose hunting in the area because they're trying to protect Dusky Canada geese, even though there may be abundant populations of Minima and Aleutian cackling geese out there that would be fine to hunt, but because of the presence of Duskies and the challenge that hunters have in discriminating among species. Oh, and by the way, in this image here, you'll notice So this photograph was taken last fall. I was on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. So on the Copper River Delta, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game marks Duskies with red collars every year. And they do this so that the collars can be read down lower 48 in Oregon and Washington, and we can keep track of annual survival of these adults. But I happened to catch some of these birds in November as they were moving south. So I thought that was kind of neat to see some of our Alaskan birds with collars that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game put out, but see them down in British Columbia. Okay, so the last one I'm going to talk about, and this is the one that we probably know the least about, or I do anyway. So these guys are both nesting and wintering in the coastal rainforest of Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. Occasionally there are a few of them that might show up in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, so Oregon and Washington, but primarily these guys don't hardly migrate. So they're quite a bit different than some of our other subspecies in Alaska. They are larger than the Duskies. And they are dark also, but in general, they're pretty similar, but a little bit bigger than Duskies. Previously, they were combined. Both the Vancouver and the Dusky subspecies were thought of as the same. We have very little information on these guys. They're generally nesting in remote coastal rainforest. We're wintering there. There's not a lot of hunting pressure, and we do not monitor this subspecies. They'd be very challenging to survey. So they're really the only subspecies that we're not monitoring in Alaska. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some information on natural history. So one thing that I think is really interesting about Canada geese is that they are so variable. Even just within Alaska, you know, they've taken advantage of so many different types of habitats, from the Arctic tundra on the North Slope all the way down to the coastal rainforest, that it's pretty amazing, really, that one bird species, or one split bird species, if you will, is able to do that. You see these guys foraging in a wide variety of habitats, from coastal lagoons at places like Eisenbeck Lagoon, where they're eating eelgrass, for instance. They might be foraging in muskegs in Southeast Alaska, or on polygonal tundra on the North Slope. So they're able to adapt to a wide variety of wild landscapes. And then, of course, they show up. If you go to Lusac Library, you see them on the lawn there. You see them in agricultural areas down in lower 48 in Oregon and Washington. So they're able to use a wide variety of habitat types. Predators, wide-ranging predators, because they're in basically all the different habitat types in Alaska. Most of our Canada and cackling geese in Alaska are tied in with the Pacific Flyway states, particularly Oregon and Washington are the big ones. But some of our cackling geese in Alaska, those on the North Slope, are actually, some of them are wintering in the Central Flyway and ending up in Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. So because these, so here's a quick map just to kind of show you the key wintering areas for our Pacific Flyway cackling and Canada geese. Here's the Willamette Valley in Oregon, southwestern Washington. That's a huge wintering area for multiple different subspecies. The Columbia Basin in eastern Washington and Oregon, and northeast California, you have the Klamath Basin, and then the Central Valley in California. Also coastal areas of Northern California, like Humboldt Bay, and coastal areas of Western Oregon, like near Pacific City, etc. So those are a lot of the common wintering areas for our Canada and cackling geese. And then, like I said, some of our North Slope birds are ending up in the Central Flyway in New Mexico, Colorado, and western part of Texas. And they would be mixing in potentially with some of the small-bodied Canada geese from Arctic Canada. All right, so nesting. So because these species are doing so many different things in this state, I just want to focus on one subspecies and tell you a little bit about them. For time constraints, I'll never get to all of them. So I'm going to talk about what I call cacklers, or the Minima subspecies, and give you some information about them. So Minima subspecies on the Yukon Delta will typically lay 4 to 5 eggs. They're white. They turn kind of off-white or rusty color after they've been incubated for a while and got to have some dirt on them from the female. They're laid typically in mid to late May. They're incubated for about 25 days, and then they're hatching out in mid to late June. They're only incubated by the female, but the male is going to be right nearby, in which he takes an incubation break. He may guard the nest, or while she's incubating, he may be guarding against other geese or predators, etc. So the male is there the whole time, but only the female is incubating. As far as brood rearing goes, these guys, that biparental care with both the male and the female continues during the brood rearing period. So ducks, for instance, it is only the female that is incubating and rearing the young, but in geese and swans, it's both parents. So once the goslings are about a day old and they dry out a bit, they get out of the nest, and from then on, they're able to feed themselves and move around. The parents oftentimes, particularly if the weather is windy and wet, they will be brooded by the parents, particularly during that first week of life, and obviously protected significantly from avian predators by the parents. During this time that the parents are leading the goslings around to different areas to feed, the parents themselves become flightless. So that's when they undergo their flightless molt. And so they may be not able to fly for 3 to 4 weeks at the same time that their young are not able to fly. And so they're all flightless together. And then once the goslings are about 6 to 7 weeks old, the goslings can fly. And of course, by then the parents would be able to fly again. So this would likely be anytime from mid-August through mid-September would be the time that everybody becomes flighted again and begins departing the Yukon Delta. So what do these guys eat? Okay, so they're herbivores, and their diet varies throughout the year. So I'm just talking about generally what do they eat in Alaska, kind of from the time they get here until they depart in the fall period. So when they first get up here and during the midsummer period, they're really focusing on vegetation. So they're eating grasses and sedges. In particular, the literature notes that they really like something called triglocan, which is marsh arrowgrass. So that's in this picture here on the right. It has a very characteristic smell. If you guys know what the plant is and you crush it with your fingers, it has kind of I don't know how to describe this smell, but I've encountered it out on the Palmer hay flats. It grows all over the place on the Yukon Delta. At any rate, they like that stuff, and apparently it really helps the goslings grow. By late summer and fall, they start transitioning into things that have more carbohydrates in them to help them put on a little bit more fat prior to migration. So they'd be eating more things in addition to the vegetation, like the seeds of grasses and sedges, berries. In this image here, I'm showing the seeds of sedges, which you guys are probably familiar with out in some of our marshes. And then berries, this is Empetrum nigrum or crowberry that folks are probably familiar with. Some people call them blackberries. They grow all different parts of the state, and shorebirds and geese will eat them in the fall. They have a lot of water in them. They also have sugar and maybe some vitamins and minerals that they need. So those are the type of things that as they transition into the fall, they might start eating more of that. Okay. Predators. I talked about this a little bit earlier, and I'm just talking about minima here on the Yukon Delta. One of the primary predators would be the Arctic fox. Glaucous gulls would be another major predator. There's mew gulls. And then Jaegers. This is a Pomeranian Jaeger, but on the Yukon Delta, it would be parasitic Jaegers. So Jaegers and gulls are really focusing on eggs and very young goslings. Arctic fox could take the adults on the nest, also would take the eggs and the younger goslings as well. Okay, so a little bit about the migration patterns of the Minima subspecies. So as we know, they're breeding and fledging off the western end of the Yukon Delta. They're coming down in the fall and staging on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Generally speaking, they're doing a transoceanic flight and ending up down in northwestern Oregon, southwestern Washington, like I talked about. In the fall, they might, or sorry, that's in the fall. In the springtime, they may take a slightly longer route and work their way up the coastline, possibly stopping along at these stopover sites on Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, Copper River Delta, Cook Inlet, etc. So they may take a more coastal route during the spring and a more of an oceanic route in the fall. So the next slide kind of shows track logs of some small body Canada geese that were marked in southwestern Washington. And it shows their spring migration kind of following the coastline up, going right through Prince William Sound, kind of right through the Anchorage area, but then crossing overland out to the Yukon Delta. And then in the fall, crossing out down the Alaska Peninsula toward Eisenbeck Refuge, and then back down to Oregon and Washington. I believe actually most of these birds were thought to be Taverner subspecies, but cacklers would be doing something very similar, except they would be crossing the Alaska Peninsula further down the peninsula, not so far out. There are some minima that show up out at Eisenbeck, and there seem to be more and more of them out there, but generally speaking, they would be crossing further up the peninsula. Okay, so in winter, when we don't see them in Alaska, when they're gone, what in the heck are they doing? So they are down in primarily agricultural areas, state and federal wildlife areas, and even urban areas outside of places like Portland, etc. So these birds are grazers, and they're looking for any short, dense vegetation that they can find out there. So they end up in places like grass seed farms, winter wheat, dairy pastures, alfalfa, and barley fields. And because of that, in some cases, particularly in some of these grass seed farms, there are agricultural depredation concerns, and it ends up becoming another one of the stakeholders in the management of the Minima subspecies is the fact that hunters tend to want larger populations, so there's more birds available to harvest, and the agricultural community wants lower populations due to the depredation issues. Okay, so just a little bit about monitoring and population status. I noticed I'm at 40 minutes here, so I'm gonna blast through this and try to get this done in the next 5 minutes. And then maybe if there are questions on specific aspects of this, I will come back and pull up some of these slides. But generally speaking, our program during May and June, we go out and we do aerial surveys. Now, like I said, this year is going to be a little bit different, but we go throughout the state. We fly everywhere from the North Slope, throughout the interior, northwestern, western Alaska, and south central Alaska, Copper River Delta. So we go to all of these different areas. We're counting geese out of the airplane, and we're getting information on their abundance to help understand each of the different subspecies. Like I said, we don't monitor the Vancouvers, and the Aleutian subspecies is monitored a little different because we don't fly out in the Aleutians. Okay, so here's the 2-second update on each species, subspecies. So cackling, Minima cackling geese are doing pretty well. They've been hovering around their population objective. So this green line is the population objective at 250,000 birds. And they've been hovering around that for many years. The last several years, they've been decreasing a little bit. So we'll be watching them to see what they're doing. Are they going to come back up again, or are they going to continue to decline? Back in the 1980s, they were down at very low numbers, but many hunting seasons were closed at that time, and they recovered very quickly into the mid to late 1990s. So generally speaking, Minima subspecies is doing pretty well. Aleutian cackling geese doing extremely well. These guys, like I said, were listed at one time, and if you look back into the 1970s and 80s, there were very few of these birds out there. Coming into the mid-90s, late 90s, they began to recover. And like I said, in 2001, they were delisted. And they've continued to increase at anywhere from 6 to 10% per year since then. So we now have approximately 200,000 Aleutian cackling geese out there. The objective is 60,000. So we're way above objective for Aleutians. Taverners. Generally stable. The long-term pattern has a slight decrease of about 1% per year over the long term. The short-term pattern is pretty stable. So no major issues there. They're just kind of holding their own, but we want to keep tabs on them because we are seeing this kind of general long-term decline. There's also indications of relatively high harvest levels down in Oregon and Washington. Lesser Canada geese are very difficult to monitor because they are nesting in the boreal forest. So they're hard to see, they're hard to count. They're in treat areas, they're along rivers, and so our average index, which is only 5,000 birds over the last 10 years, may be stable over the 10-year and long term, but it's generally speaking much lower than the actual population. And as you'll notice, in any given year, the number of these birds that we count is highly variable because they are hard to detect. Some years we happen to see more of them, other years we happen to see fewer. So they are one of the more difficult subspecies to monitor. Duskies, like I said earlier, populations are relatively low. Our 10-year average is around 14,000 right now, which is below the objective of 20,000 birds. So we're below that, but we're above certain action levels that require us to take more drastic measures. So they have been increasing for a period of time and have kind of stabilized again, but we would like to see this population grow over 20,000 birds, but it's not happening. So that's why they continue to be close to hunting down in the lower 48. Okay. So it's about 45 minutes here. So I'm wondering if I should just halt now. I'm wondering, Nicole, or if I should go for a couple more.
Yeah, I think that would, it would probably be good to open it up for questions now. And it's hard to, so much information, you know, keep it all in there. So right. No problem. I'll invite people to go ahead and ask their questions in the chat, and I can relay those to David. And I guess I'll start it off with one question. I've learned a lot here. Oh, well, I'll hold my question because I can access you much easier. So this is from Penny, who says she would love to hear about social practices, their social practices. How do they nest when flying long distances? And for example, she says they're thousands of feet in the air but get thirsty or want a break. Would they abandon their group? There's another example is, how do they keep track of their migratory group? What if they get lost on the ground or in the air from their buddies? And are they attracted to population centers like Anchorage, or do we just happen to live in their habitat and they're all over South Central? So I guess kind of 2 points or 3. Social practices. How do they rest when they're flying long distances? And with that, how do they keep track of their migratory group? And are they attracted to population centers?
Okay,
Good
I
question.
will. It's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Many of which I don't know the answers to, but I will. I'll start with that one toward the end, which is about the urban areas. And I think they are actually attracted to the urban areas because we do things that they like. Like, for instance, we grow lawns. We have golf courses and libraries and places with these beautiful green lawns that we water and fertilize, which is ideal food for them. And there's little to no predators present in urban areas. Now, there's going to be people and dogs and things like that, but we've basically created a great spot for geese. And we know that because when we try to walk around, say, Anchorage, at Lusac Library or Cuddy Park, there is goose poop everywhere. So I think in general, these urban areas can kind of attract geese to them to where they can create a nuisance. Obviously, these geese, the same subspecies that would be right here in Anchorage, is very well adapted to living in the boreal forest on the any of the rivers and wetlands in places like the Yukon Flats or the Colville River, or, so they can live all over the state, but I do believe that we've created pockets of them here. Part of the reason why, and because of the concerns of geese and aviation, why we tried to decrease the population of geese in Anchorage. I guess it was probably 15, 20 years ago or something. So anyway, so that's my bit on that. As far as migrating, that's a tough one. I mean, there's more and more work done with these things that we call GSM or GPS transmitters, where we get that really fine scale information about when a bird moves, not just it went from Alaska to Oregon, but exactly how did it get there. And from some of the work that's going on, we can look at some of that, but generally speaking, they tend to stage in areas. Let's say they're on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula feeding, fattening up, resting, waiting for the weather to be just right, because they like to, when the storm systems move by and create a tailwind, then they get up. A lot of times you see them testing the air currents and things, and when things are just right, large numbers of them will move, and oftentimes make that long shot across the North Gulf of Alaska all at once. So maybe in a day or two, bam, they're down in Oregon. Then they're going to get there and they're going to rest again. So oftentimes they do it in pulses, if you will. They get to an area that they can rest for several days to several weeks, then they move a big distance and then they rest again. So if that helps answer the question. As far as the social dynamics during migration, that is extremely difficult to answer. I guess I don't know the answer to that question. There is a lot of information about how geese fly specifically in the V formations and how they rotate. You'll see them rotating through to who's up in the front of the V, and as the individuals rotate around in that position. So there are a lot of social dynamics going on. I don't understand it though, so I'll be honest. Anyway.
No, great. Thank you. Yeah, and we're getting some thank yous in the chats. And also, when you submit your question, let us know where you're viewing from. We've had people from all over the world listen to these Wildlife Wednesdays, so we'd love to hear how you heard of this and why you're interested in this topic. We have another question. What are the best field marks to distinguish cacklers from lesser Canadian geese?
Okay, so, and maybe I'll just pull back a couple slides here to show. I want to show that picture of the Minima subspecies, for instance. So I think one of the easiest ones to tell apart is the Minima, because they are on the farthest end of the spectrum. They're the smallest and super dark breast, very short neck, tiny little stubby bill. So those things together, and then that really high-pitched call. So those would be the best ways to tell a Minima apart. Particularly if you're comparing something like if you were in Anchorage and you saw what is likely lesser Canada geese, and then there was a couple smaller ones in there. Could be a Taverner's Canada goose. It could be a Minima, you know, could even be something like an Aleutian. But, you know, in general, the size of the bill, the color of the breast, the length of the neck, and the overall size of the bird, if that helps.
Great. Another question is more detail about that V shape. So what exactly is the benefit of flying in that V formation?
Okay, I'll try my best here. To be honest, that is not an area that I know a ton about, but generally speaking, if you think about bike racers, car racing, stock car racing, all these kind of things, there's a whole idea of wind drafting, right? So the individual in the front is creating sort of a wind shadow for the person behind them. And so when you're flying in a V formation, the bird in the front is breaking all the wind. Then the bird behind them and to the left is getting some advantage of that air being broken on, say, their right wing. The next bird back's getting a little bit of that advantage on what. So they're all sort of helping each other, but the person, the goose in the front is the one breaking the wind for everybody. So they're getting the least benefit. And I think that's why they're rotating through into that position. So I think my understanding, and this is my uninformed opinion, is that basically they're wind drafting each other. And so they're using each other to reduce friction, if you will, but then rotating through so that one individual isn't breaking trail for everybody, if you will.
Wow, very smart. Last question I have, and if you have any more questions, feel free to open the chat. It's in the bottom corner of your screen with a little text bubble. And let me just scroll up here. Yes, so what are the honing mechanisms for birds, particularly these geese, to know where they're going? Is it learned, or is it, what's the theory onto how they know where they're going when they go, more or less?
Okay, that's another very good question. Also very hard to answer, but pretty much all birds are extremely good at navigating, and we don't really understand how they could possibly be so good. But generally speaking, most, particularly female waterfowl, are very, what we call philopatric, right? They have a love of their fatherland, if you will. They're coming back to where they themselves hatched and learned to fly. That's a trait that is common in a lot of waterfowl. Geese, Canada geese in particular, would be very site faithful. So if they hatched on a Copper River Delta in a certain string of wetlands, they are likely eventually going to come back there. Geese, so one way they can learn is that geese migrate as a family. Ducks don't necessarily do that. So when they leave in the fall, the young will migrate south with the parents. When they come back in the spring, we think that those birds that are now almost a year old sometimes follow the parents back up. So there could be some actual learning of the route from their parents. So that's one possible way. However, ducks can find their way back to where they hatched, and they don't migrate back with their parents. So some of that is just innate in certain species, and we don't really understand. So there are some behavioral ways they can learn it, and other ways that are just, it's like they have an internal GPS and we don't really understand how it works.
Well, I'll do one more question, and we're getting some thank yous in the chat. Ed says, thanks for the fantastic presentation. I sure appreciated it and learned so much about geese, and he's in Soldotna. Penny says, thank you, and asks, who or what are their main predators?
Okay, that's a good one. So it depends, you know, obviously if we're talking about breeding season or wintering season, but let's just talk about nest predators. and it's really variable because of the different habitats they're in. So take a place like the Copper River Delta. One of the major nest predators out there is bald eagles, because what happens out there is that there are a lot of bald eagles in that area waiting for the fish runs to start, and there's not a lot of food. And whoop, here's these geese, and the bald eagles are actually try to take sometimes the adults, but also the eggs. So bald eagles can be a major predator on the Copper River Delta. Also, things like wolves, coyotes, and grizzly bears. So in that area where you're in more of a forested coastal area, you have raptors and carnivores. When you're on the Yukon Delta and kind of the open tundra of the North Slope, the predators are going to be primarily avian, like I said, gulls and jaegers, snowy owls, things like that. And then also Arctic and red fox would be another big one, depending on where you are in the state.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm going to stop questions there so that we can let David go on towards his evening. But David, as I said before, this is a huge ask and takes so much time to put together. So we really appreciate it. And if you all have other questions, we encourage you can reach out to David through his email, which I can post on maybe on the Facebook page after this, and on our events page on our website. And before we sign off, I just wanted to say thanks again for joining us. And in the chat, if you could just say where you're from and what brought you to this talk. We count this as kind of our applause, our virtual applause for David. So if you have any things to say or comment on, this is your opportunity. And thanks again, David. Really, really appreciate it and learned a lot. I was taking notes the whole time. So next week, we're going to have a Trivia Tuesday about geese. So everyone should stay tuned. Even the waterfowl, I did not know that was the definition of waterfowl, working in wildlife advocacy this whole time. And Penny says, thanks from Anchorage, smiley face. So I'll stay on the line, but David, thank you again. And if people just want to sign off on the chat before they go, we're happy to see you. Thumbs up from Karen. Great.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you guys for listening. And yeah, I just had a couple more slides in there about management stuff, but obviously just too much information. It's a broad topic, but anyway, thanks for listening, folks. And I hope that some questions that people have were answered there. And yeah, just let me know if people have any other questions. So, and thank you, Nicole, for hosting it and for inviting us to give some information and talk about our program a little bit.
Yeah, no, we're so lucky to have these amazing biologists right in our backyard. So we want to take advantage of it. Okay, great. Oh, we have Sue from Fairbanks. She says, thanks so much. Here in Fairbanks, we see so many Canada geese with occasionally cackling, I think. So this has been very helpful. Thank you, Sue. Yeah, it's a tough distinction. All right, David, well, we'll let you go. Everyone feel free to hop off whenever, but I'll stay around on the call for just a little bit more.
Okay. See you guys. Right. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay. I just have to figure out how to sign up.
Too.